Congratulations, you've just woken up in Francia in the year 567. The good news, you're not a slave, probably. The bad news, you're still living in the crumbling leftovers of the Roman Empire, and personal hygiene is optional at best. Your home is likely a drafty wooden hut with a thatched roof that leaks when it rains, which is often. There's no running water indoors, no toilets, just buckets and the nearest ditch. Forget central heating. You're relying on a smoky fire pit in the middle of the floor, sharing the warmth with your family and whatever livestock you keep indoors. The smell, let's just say scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they had, they couldn't compete with the aroma of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and whatever's fermenting in the corner. Your bed is a straw mattress teeming with unwelcome tiny guests that make sleep an itchy nightmare. But hey, at least you're not dealing with the headaches of royalty. Speaking of royalty, let's talk about the Franks. These were the folks who moved into the former Roman territory of Gaul. The Romans used to think they were terrifying monsters with wild hair and throwing axes. But honestly, after a few centuries, the Franks decided they liked Roman stuff a lot. They wanted the fancy buildings, the paved roads, even if they were falling apart, and definitely the prestige. At this particular moment in 567, the Frankish lands were ruled by 4 brothers, sons of a guy named Clothar, who had managed to reunite the kingdom for a hot minute before dropping dead and dividing it up again like a messy inheritance. These brothers? Not exactly the Brady Bunch. They were constantly squabbling, trying to grab each other's territory. There was Charibert, the oldest, who ruled from Paris and had a truly wild love life that shocked even the less than shockable Franks. Then there was Guntram, the crafty middle child, ruling from Burgundy. And finally, the 2 youngest, Sigebert in Austrasia, the eastern part, and Chilperic in Neustria, the western part, who pretty much hated each other's guts and were constantly at war. Now, Sigebert, our guy in Austrasia, decided he needed to level up. His brothers were marrying local women, sometimes even their own servants. Gasp. But Sigebert, he wanted prestige. He wanted power. He wanted a bride who screamed, "I am important." So he looked south to Spain, where the Visigoths ruled. Their king Athanagild had 2 daughters, famous for their beauty and royal blood. Sigebert set his sights on the younger one, Princess Brunhild. Imagine this, a princess from sunny Roman-influenced Spain, where cities still had baths and paved streets, about to marry into the rough and tumble world of the Franks. Brunhild was around 18, reportedly beautiful, smart, and educated. She'd grown up seeing her mother, Queen Goiswintha, wield real political influence, and she was ready to be more than just a pretty face on the throne. Sigebert's court in Metz was trying its best to look fancy for the occasion. His palace was a repurposed Roman building, probably still a bit dusty around the edges. They rolled out the red carpets, or at least the thickest rugs they had, hung tapestries to hide the crumbling walls, and even hired a poet named Venantius Fortunatus to write a flattering poem for the wedding. Fortunatus was a bit of a newcomer, trying to make a name for himself in the Frankish world, which bizarrely was obsessed with all things Roman. He probably sweat through his tunic as he stood there trying to remember his lines about Cupid and Venus for an audience that probably still worshipped Thor. But hey, a gig was a gig, and a good performance could make his career. Brunhild arrived with a wagon train overflowing with treasure, gold, silver, jewels, fine clothes. She was escorted by Sigebert's right-hand man, a young, ambitious guy named Go. As she walked into the hall, everyone stared. Was she just another piece of treasure, or something more? Later, they'd learn the answer was definitely something more. Sigebert, at 32, was reportedly handsome and a skilled warrior. He was genuinely pleased with his bride. This wasn't just a love match, though. This was a power play. By marrying a foreign princess with serious connections, Sigebert was sending a clear message to his brothers. He was the one aiming for greatness, for a kingdom that echoed the glory of Rome. This did not go over well, especially with Chilperic. He was the youngest brother, constantly feeling overlooked and shortchanged. While Sigebert was making a splash with a foreign princess, Chilperic was, involved with a slave girl at his court. This wasn't uncommon. Frankish kings often had multiple relationships, sometimes even marrying servants. It was a way to produce heirs without getting tangled up with powerful noble families. But Chilperic, he was besotted with this girl, Fredegund. Fredegund had climbed her way up from kitchen slave to a trusted servant of Chilperic's first wife, Queen Audovera. Now she was the king's favorite, maybe even his unofficial wife. It took serious smarts and a ruthless streak to pull that off in this world. She was born during a truly awful time. The mid-6th century was hit by volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun and brought famine, followed by the bubonic plague, which swept through Europe like a scythe. It was a time of death and upheaval, but also of opportunity for those cunning enough to seize it. Fredegund was definitely one of the cunning ones. Chilperic was so smitten with Fredegund that he'd already sent his perfectly respectable first wife off to a convent. Now, hearing about Sigebert's prestigious marriage, he was furious. He saw it as a direct challenge, but Fredegund, watching from the sidelines, was probably just calculating. She saw how the king reacted to everything, how his mood shifted. She knew that her position, despite the king's infatuation, was precarious. She was a slave, worth less than a cow in the eyes of the law, but she had survived worse, and she was ambitious. For now she watched and waited. Meanwhile, in Paris, the eldest brother, Cheribert, was having problems of his own. His latest wife was a teenage shepherdess named Thudegild, and while she'd just given him a longed-for son, the baby died almost immediately. Cheribert, getting on in years and still without a living heir, promptly married again, and this time he married a nun. Now, marrying a nun was a huge no-no in the eyes of the church, and the Frankish church, though still pretty young and fragile, was trying to lay down the law. They were already struggling with priests who refused to stop sleeping with their wives, and people who still liked worshiping trees. Cheribert's scandalous marriage was a direct challenge. Things got even worse for Cheribert. An epidemic hit Paris, and the bishops were quick to blame the king's sinful behavior. 9 of his bishops planned a meeting to confront him. Cheribert, either clueless or arrogant, let them. It did not go well. They begged him to leave the nun. He flatly refused, and for that he became the first Frankish king to be excommunicated. Talk about bad press. Stunned and now a pariah, Cheribert retreated to a villa outside Bordeaux. He went hunting to clear his head and conveniently dropped dead, likely of a heart attack. What do you do with an excommunicated king's body? You can't bury him in sacred ground, not alongside his famous grandfather Clovis, so they carted him off to an old Roman fort and buried him like a pagan. Not exactly the send-off a king who saw himself as the heir to Roman glory would have wanted. Back in Metz, Brunhild and Sigebert weren't shedding too many tears for Cheribert. They were too busy figuring out how his death affected them. 4 kingdoms were now 3. Who would get the best pieces of the pie? And what about Cheribert's considerable wealth? Enter Thudegild, the shepherdess queen. Cast aside for a nun, she now saw her chance. The nun was dead, her marriage invalid in the church's eyes. Thudegild, as the briefly mother of the king's son, could claim to be the rightful widow, and as a royal widow, she had access to the treasury. Frankish queens couldn't command armies, but they could hand out gifts, coins to a bishop, jewels to a noble, to build alliances. Theudegild had bigger plans. She loaded up all of Cherabert's gold and jewels onto carts. She must have had help from some bribed guards and servants. She stashed the treasure, and then, channeling her inner Roman empress, proposed marriage to the next eldest brother, Guntram. Guntram, ever the crafty one, saw an opportunity. He told her to come, bring her treasure, and he'd give her an honorable place. Theudegild, hopeful, rode south with the goods. Guntram welcomed her, took the treasure, laughed in her face, called her unworthy, and then, just like Chilperic had done with Audovera, packed her off to a nunnery in Arles. He then married one of his own ex-wife's former slaves. So much for honor. For Brunhild, watching this unfold from Metz, there was a harsh lesson. Playing politics was dangerous for queens. Men hoarded power and would crush a woman's ambition without a second thought. And Theudegild's story ended even worse. She tried to escape the convent with a Visigoth, was caught and beaten mercilessly, left to suffer until she died. It was a grim preview of the world Brunhild was navigating. But unlike Theudegild, Brunhild had powerful family connections, ambition, and a keen mind, and she was about to prove that she wouldn't be so easily cast aside. In the months after her wedding, Brunhild was settling into life in Metz. It wasn't Toledo, but it was prosperous, surrounded by pleasant countryside. The view from her palace window included an old Roman amphitheater where instead of gladiators, they now had bear baiting. Charming. She found the Frankish court a bit rustic. They liked loud national epics instead of sophisticated poetry. She had admirers but few companions. Her Latin was excellent, but most nobles spoke a deformed version, or Frankish. She missed her mother and sister, the poet Fortunatus. Still hanging around after the wedding, hoping for more work, was a welcome distraction. He matched her education and entertained her with tales of his travels. But soon Fortunatus was off again, this time to Paris, hired by the recently excommunicated Cheribert. Cheribert, nearing 50 and heirless, was trying to salvage his image with a grand ceremony and a flattering poem. Fortunatus, ever the opportunist, delivered, praising Cheribert as a most excellent king and comparing him to the conquering emperor Trajan. He even sucked up to the clergy, calling Cheribert pious and mature. It was a master class in flattery, especially since Cheribert's scandal was still fresh. But the bishops weren't fooled. The church was fighting for its place in this chaotic world. They were trying to enforce rules against incest and married priests, and Cheribert's public defiance was unacceptable. When the epidemic hit Paris, the bishops saw it as divine judgment. They finally excommunicated him. Cheribert's death left his kingdom open for the taking. His brothers Sigebert, Guntram, and Chilperic immediately started squabbling over it. Gundevald, Sigebert's illegitimate half-brother, who'd been living at Cheribert's court and was rumored to be his heir, was quickly hustled away and had his hair cut, the Frankish way of saying, "You're out of the running for the throne." Brunhild, meanwhile, got pregnant. This was great news. A male heir would solidify her position. She probably felt a pang of sympathy for Gundevald, another outsider like her now sidelined. But the baby was a girl, another potential heir for the Frankish world, but not the son Brunhild needed to feel truly secure. Still, the division of Cheribert's lands went ahead. In early 5068, Paris, the old capital, was declared neutral territory to be shared. The rest was carved up. Chilperic, always feeling cheated, got the smallest share, a patchwork kingdom in the north and southwest. This left him furious, especially since Cheribert's got strategically important cities like Tours and Poitiers right in the middle of Chilperic's new lands. Chilperic, ever the hothead, immediately invaded Tours and Poitiers, breaking the fragile peace. His army was led by his eldest son, Theudebert, the very boy Sigebert had spared years earlier after another of Chilperic's failed invasions. This forced Theudebert to break his oath to his uncle, a major no-no in this honor-bound society. But Chilperic's attack failed again. He was boxed in, surrounded by his brothers, and in the south by Brunhild's people, the Visigoths. Chilperic needed a new strategy. He needed a prestigious alliance to match Sigebert's. And who better than Brunhild's own sister, Galswintha? King Athanagild of Spain wouldn't have considered Chilperic before, but now Chilperic had land next to Spain, and he made an offer no one could refuse. He would give Galswintha a massive morganah, mourning gift, not just jewels or a villa, but the entire southern third of his kingdom, 5 wealthy cities in the Aquitaine. This was unheard of. Chilperic was risking everything, but he wanted this alliance, and he wanted to outdo Sigebert. Athanagild agreed, but with a condition. Galswintha would convert to Catholicism, but Chilperic had to swear a solemn oath to abandon all other women. Everyone knew this meant Fredegund. Chilperic, eager for the alliance, agreed. Fredegund, the slave girl, was to be sent away, but Fredegund wasn't about to disappear quietly. She kept her own counsel, and she waited. While Chilperic was scrambling for a new bride, Sigebert was basking in the glow of his successful marriage and the birth of his daughter, Ingund. He was building churches, repairing infrastructure in Metz, trying to project an image of a wise Roman-style ruler. He was also securing his borders, making alliances. He'd already dealt with the Avars in the east and the Saxons in the north. Now he looked south to Italy, controlled by the Lombards, and beyond them, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, ruling from Constantinople, still saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome and were trying to reclaim Italy. Sigebert wanted to befriend the new Byzantine emperor, Justin II, who was reportedly kind of erratic and whose wife Sophia was the real power behind the throne. To approach the Byzantines subtly, Sigebert turned to an unlikely figure, his father's 4th wife, Radegund. Radegund was a Thuringian princess, captured as a child and forced into marriage with King Clothar. But she had found her escape in fierce piety. She refused to sleep with the king, starved herself, wore hair shirts, and even branded herself. Finally, after Clothar murdered her baby brother, she left him entirely and became a nun. Radegund was no ordinary nun. She established one of the first convents for women in Francia, Holy Cross Abbey in Poitiers. From there, she became a major political and religious figure, welcoming dignitaries and corresponding with foreign rulers, including the Byzantines. So Sigebert and Brunhild sent emissaries to Radegund, including the poet Fortunatus. Their plan? Use Radegund's religious connections to open a channel to Byzantium. Radegund wanted a piece of the True Cross, a highly prized relic held in Constantinople. She sent her own messengers with a powerful poem, seemingly a personal account of the Frankish invasion that destroyed her homeland, but also a subtle warning to the Byzantines. The Franks are brutal, but they listen to me. It was a brilliant diplomatic move. The response came from Empress Sophia. She sent the relic, solidifying a connection with Radegund, and through her, Brunhild. Soon after, Sigebert sent his own embassy, formalizing an alliance with Byzantium. This alliance also created a bond between Brunhild and Radegund. Brunhild, still lonely at court, found a friend in the influential abbess Radegund, who even welcomed Brunhild's sister Galswintha when she arrived in Frankish lands for her wedding to Chilperic in July 56-8. Fortunatus noted their close exchanges, with Radegund offering motherly love. Galswintha's arrival in Rouen was a spectacle. Chilperic, trying desperately to match Sigebert's prestige, met her with his entire army kneeling. The wedding was in the cathedral, not a repurposed building. Galswintha came with even more treasure than Brunhild. But less than 6 months later, tragedy struck. Galswintha caught Chilperic in bed with Fredegund. Despite his oath, she was furious, humiliated, and demanded to return home, even if it meant leaving her enormous dowry. Then one morning, Galswintha was found dead in her bed, strangled. 3 days later, dressed in Galswintha's jewels, Fredegund married Chilperic in a quick ceremony at a royal villa. The Frankish world was shocked. Gregory of Tours, the bishop who would chronicle this era, stated plainly what everyone suspected. Chilperic had ordered Galswintha's murder. Later art would even portray Chilperic himself doing the deed, sometimes with Fredegund watching. Fredegund's origins were murky. She was a slave, and the historical record is silent on her family. This fueled rumors and suspicion. How did a slave gain such power? Some whispered witchcraft. A later story claimed she'd tricked Chilperic's first wife, using obscure church law, but that tale wasn't true at the time. Still, it shows Fredegund had a reputation for being clever, maybe even literate, unusual for a slave. She hadn't thrown a fit when Galswintha arrived. She'd waited. Now she was queen, but her position was shaky. Chilperic had other heirs, sons from his first marriage. Fredegund had to produce children, hopefully sons, to secure her future. Lying in the bed where Galswintha had died, Fredegund must have felt the weight of it all. Fortunatus, hearing the news, wrote about the 2 towers from Toledo. One broken, Brunhild was devastated. In less than 2 years, she'd lost her homeland, her father, and now her only sister, likely murdered by her own husband. She was alone in a foreign land, with a language barrier. Frankish law, the Lex Salica, had surprisingly high values for women, especially those of childbearing age. A free woman was worth as much as an aristocrat, even more if pregnant. A queen's worth was incalculable. But who had the power to enforce justice for Galswintha? Brunhild knew she couldn't just grieve. She needed political power. She needed allies. The nobles at Sigebert's court were divided into factions. One wanted closer ties with Byzantium, another with Chilperic, a third with Guntram. Brunhild understandably leaned towards the anti-Chilperic group, led by her old escort, Go, a young ambitious count who'd risen through the ranks. Go saw an opportunity in Galswintha's death. This was a perfect excuse for a war with Neustria to avenge their queen's sister and seize valuable land. Galswintha's Morganage gave Go, along with Roman-leaning allies like the poet and governor, Dynamius, and the warrior Duke Lupus, a starting point. They started building their case. Their main opposition was Bishop Aegidius of Rheims, a powerful figure who favored peace with Neustria, partly because his family had land disputes with the Lupus in the Champagne region. Aegidius and his allies also included traditionalist Franks, who disliked Roman influence and foreign queens. Then there was Duke Gundram Boso. This guy was a legendary warrior, fearless and unpredictable, driven by self-interest. He led the pro-Byzantine faction, but really he was pro himself. He was easily swayed by the promise of plunder and glory. Gun's faction knew they needed Boso on their side. A war with Neustria offered plenty of action. Boso, despite his volatile nature, agreed not to oppose them. The plan? A propaganda campaign. Fortunatus was commissioned to write an elegy for Galswintha. It wasn't just a poem of mourning, it was a political weapon. It painted Galswintha as a saintly victim and highlighted the outrage in Spain, reminding the Franks that Chilperic's actions could lead to a Visigothic invasion. Then, in 570, the timing was perfect. Brunhild gave birth to a son on Easter morning, a good omen. He was named Childebert, after Sigebert's famous uncle. This secured the succession in Austrasia and strengthened the alliance with Guntram, who was now convinced that any lands recovered from Chilperic would stay in Frankish hands through Brunhild's son. King Guntram, as the eldest brother, presided over a court convened to try Chilperic for Galswintha's murder. Chilperic, not surprisingly, didn't show up and was convicted in absentia. The verdict gave Sigebert and Guntram the pretext they needed to invade Nostria, starting with Galswintha's Morganege, but aiming to take Chilperic's entire kingdom. The war was on. Sigebert and Guntram's armies, now united, rolled through Nostrian territory. The cities of Galswintha's dowry surrendered quickly. Things were going so well, Guntram, in a moment of typical indecisiveness, almost backed out, worried that a too powerful Sigebert would come after his kingdom next. But Sigebert, showing his daring side, recruited pagan Germanic troops from his vassal kingdoms, essentially creating a mercenary army. Faced with this unruly force on his border, Guntram rejoined the fight. Chilperic was losing. He fled his capital, Soissons, with Fredegund and their children. Fredegund had given birth to a daughter, Rigunth, and a son, Clothar. Her position was more secure as the mother of an heir, but still precarious. As the war intensified, Fredegund's son's prospects improved in the most brutal way possible. Chilperic's eldest son, Theudebert, leading a doomed defense, was killed by Duke Gundram Boso. Now only 2 of Chilperic's sons from his first marriage remained, and they were also in the thick of the fighting. Fredegund was pregnant again, hoping for another son, an heir and a spare. Sigebert and his army, joined by the formidable Duke Boso, were pushing north. Messengers were sent to bring Brunhild and the children to Paris for a triumphant entry. Bishop Germain of Paris, fearing the city would be destroyed, wrote to Brunhild directly, calling her most excellent queen and begging her to spare Paris. This was a clear sign of her growing influence. Brunhild had also used her influence to get her ally Gregory appointed Bishop of Tours, an important and wealthy city. Gregory, despite his snobbery, owed Brunhild a favor. Tours now fell under Chilperic's control, but everyone expected that to be temporary. Chilperic and his family were holed up in Tournai, under siege. Fredegund was in labor. She gave birth to another boy, but was overcome by a fear of death and initially refused to hold or baptize him. Chilperic, shaken from his stupor, intervened, forcing the baptism. The baby was given the strange, un-Frankish name of Samson. News reached Sigebert that the nobles in Chilperic's northern territories were ready to defect and declare him king of all Nostria. Sigebert rode out to accept their offer, leaving Paris to join the siege of Tournai and finish off his brother. But Fredegund, even in her weakened state, wasn't done. She called for 2 slave boys, and in a bold and unprecedented move, gave them poisoned daggers and sent them to assassinate Sigebert during his inauguration celebration at Vitry-en-Artois. It was a suicide mission, but she promised their families rewards. The boys succeeded. They stabbed Sigebert, and within minutes, the magnificent victor was dead. Chilperic rushed to Vitry-en-Artois, saw his brother's body, and ordered a proper burial. The siege was over. They could return to their palace. Sigebert's assassination broke the rules of warfare. It was seen as cowardly and underhanded, and the rumors of Fredegund's involvement, of her using poison, a word linked to witchcraft, solidified her reputation as a ruthless, maybe even magical figure. Gregory of Tours, ever biased, called her actions maleficiatus, witchcraft. The Franks believed in witches, even if they couldn't agree on dragons. Accusing someone of witchcraft was serious. far worse than calling a woman a slut. It was an attack on her very being. But Fredegund didn't seem to care. She preferred to be feared as she returned to Swissons with Chilperic. She likely met the fearful gazes of the crowds with a smile. In the chaos after Sigebert's death, many who had defected to him rushed back to pledge loyalty to Chilperic. Some even joined them in executing Sigebert's attendants. The remaining Austrasians, stunned, retreated to Metz to regroup, leaving Brunhild and her children in Paris. Brunhild, now a widow for the second time, was trapped. She had her personal treasure, but not the royal treasury needed to buy loyalty. Her best chance was to keep her son, young Childebert, alive. 5-year-old boys were vulnerable, and Chilperic was marching towards Paris. Childebert had to be smuggled out. Accounts differ. Hidden in a basket, a cart, passed through a window in a sack to a boat on the Seine. Her daughters were also sent away, reaching safety just over the Austrasian border. Chilperic arrived in Paris expecting to find Brunhild and her children, but found her alone. He seized her and her treasure, then sent men to find the children. They caught the daughters in Millau, but missed Childebert. Chilperic, perhaps feeling magnanimous after surviving and regaining his kingdom, ordered Brunhild kept alive, but sent to a convent in ruin under the care of Bishop Praetextatus. Her daughters were to remain hostages. Back in Metz, the Austrasian court was somber. A 5-year-old boy was crowned king, alarming warriors who expected an attack from Chilperic. Go, Brunhild's ally, became the boy's regent, his nutritor, the one who feeds the king. Brunhild found herself in the convent in Rouen, a place for widowed queens. Life there was austere, rough robes, prayers at all hours, manual labor. She hated it. Her only way out was to marry again. Her mother Goiswintha had done it, marrying her dead husband's successor to keep her power. Meanwhile, Sigebert's half-brother, Gundevald, the one who'd had his hair cut, had escaped Byzantine custody and was now living in Constantinople. The Byzantines saw him as a potential puppet king if the Merovingian brothers kept killing each other off. With Sigebert dead and a child on the throne, Gundevald seemed like a good option for a new husband for Brunhild. He was a carbon copy of Sigebert, a Merovingian prince, and he had a rapport with Brunhild. But getting a bride out of a Neustrian convent was tricky, and Empress Sophia in Byzantium was dealing with her husband Justin II's madness, barking and biting his chamberlains. A more immediate possibility for Brunhild's escape emerged closer to home. Chilperic's first wife, Autovera, was living in Rouen, possibly at the same convent as Brunhild. They had a lot in common. Ousted queens targeted by Fredegund. Autovera's sons were now threatened by Fredegund's living boy. Walking the convent gardens, a plan took shape, a marriage between Brunhild and Autovera's eldest surviving son, Maravech, who was leading Chilperic's army. This wasn't romance, it was rebellion. Maravech would depose his father, rule Neustria, and Brunhild would be queen again, her body the link between the two kingdoms. They would need help from the nuns, using the convent's back channels to communicate and plan. Maravech, sent by Chilperic to conquer territory, instead rode to Tours, where Brunhild's ally, Bishop Gregory, and Duke Boso, hiding from Chilperic, were it's unclear who the messenger was. Gregory, the well-connected nun Ingetrude, living in the basilica courtyard, or even Boso himself, still looking for a way to gain favor. Regardless, Maravech got the message. Instead of going south as ordered, he marched his army north to Rouen to visit his mother. Brunhild's second wedding was a stark contrast to her first. Dressed in her finest, no longer in a nun's habit, she married Maravech in the cathedral in Rouen. the bishop praetextatus, Maravech's godfather, officiated, defying Chilperic and ignoring the church's incest prohibitions. The cathedral was empty, a quiet rebellion. Outside, Maravech's army waited. Messages slipped through networks of abbesses. Priests and farmers had orchestrated a coup. They had soldiers. Brunhild had the money, her personal treasure, now under Praetextatus's care, used to bribe nobles, and they had the element of surprise. Their plan, assassinate Chilperic. If that failed, attack his capital Soissons from two sides, Maravech from the west, Duke Lupus from the east, with a man on the inside to open the gates. It was a solid plan. But Chilperic, getting wind of the marriage and potential plot, marched on ruin sooner than expected. Maravech and Brunhild were trapped. They hunkered down inside the city walls, hoping for reinforcements. If the walls fell, they would seek sanctuary in a small chapel dedicated to Saint Martin, the patron saint of the Franks, built high on the city walls. They also decided to portray the marriage as a love-struck elopement, hoping Chilperic would be more lenient with a son blinded by passion than with a political rival. Chilperic arrived, and a standoff ensued. Eventually, a truce was called. Chilperic swore not to separate them if it was God's will. He met with them, shared a meal, seemingly accepting their story. But then news arrived. Lupus's army was attacking Soissons. The attack failed, but it revealed the true scope of the rebellion. Chilperic realized his son, his wife, and many of his nobles were involved. He began purging his court. Maravech was stripped of his rank and placed under guard. Chilperic gave Maravech's military command to his younger brother Clovis. Chilperic also moved to delegitimize Maravech's marriage. He added a specific law to the Lex Salica, banning marriage to a dead uncle's wife, making Brunhild and Maravech's union illegal. Then, in the autumn of 5076, he had Maravech tonsured, shaving his head like a monk, a symbolic removal from the royal line. Maravech was ordained a priest, meaning any children with Brunhild would be sacrilege. He was to be sent to a monastery, essentially a state prison. Chilperic gave Brunhild a choice: abandon Maravech and return to Austrasia with her daughters, or stay and lose everything. Brunhild chose her children. Chilperic, eager to be rid of her and avoid scandal, even let her keep her treasure, which she conveniently left with Bishop Praetextatus, to fund future rebellions. Brunhild returned to Metz, reunited with her children. Her son, Childebert, clung to her, never wanting to be separated again. Her allies, Go and Lupus, were still at court, their faction now in the ascendancy. Brunhild was back, and though she had lost a husband and a kingdom, she had saved her children and learned valuable lessons in survival and political maneuvering. Maravech never made it to the monastery. A deacon from Tours, sent by Bishop Gregory Brunhild's ally and Duke Boso, hiding in the basilica, urged Maravech to seek sanctuary in St. Martin's Basilica in Tours. Maravech escaped with the help of his loyal friend Gallian and arrived in Tours during Mass, demanding sanctuary. Chilperic, seeing treachery everywhere, relied more and more on Fredegund, who emerged as a powerful political advisor. Fredegund, rightly suspicious of Gregory's involvement in Maravech's escape, publicly accused Gregory's envoys of being spies and had them exiled. A standoff developed in Tours, with Maravech and Boso holed up in the basilica and Chilperic's count, Ludist, Gregory's enemy, trying to smoke them out. Ludist, a former slave who'd risen to power, clearly irritated the snobbish Gregory. Skirmishes broke out between Maravech's supporters and Ludiston's men. Chilperic threatened to burn the countryside if Gregory didn't hand over Maravech. Gregory refused. Maravech considered his options. Staying would endanger Tours. Challenging his father head-on seemed impossible. He needed a new plan. Meanwhile, Fredegund, still suspecting Boso's loyalty, or lack thereof, sent him a secret message: get Moravec out of the church, and he'd be rewarded. She knew Boso was too much given to breaking his word, and could be bought. Boso, restless and seeking a way back into favor, accepted. He lured Moravec out under the pretense of a hunting trip. Fredegund's plan was likely for an assassin to strike, but it failed. Still, Fredegund now knew Boso could be manipulated. Boso, however, consulted his soothsayer, who predicted Chilperic's death and Moravec's rise. Convinced, Boso decided to help Moravec again. They planned to flee to Austrasia. They escaped, but were delayed, and the political situation changed dramatically. In the spring of 5077, King Guntram lost his 2 teenage sons to dysentery, leaving him heirless. He offered to adopt Brunhild's son Childebert, creating an alliance between Burgundy and Austrasia on one condition: the war must end. Brunhild was in a difficult position. Fredegund and Childebert were her enemies, but supporting Moravec would jeopardize her son's claim to Burgundy. Moravec and Boso finally reached Austrasia, but found little support. Childebert and Guntram were pushing for the rebellion to end. Moravec, a man without a country, was on the run again. Childebert, unable to catch Moravec, ravaged Tours and plundered the basilica. Brunhild, unable to openly help Moravec, hid him on Duke Lupus's land near Reims. Fredegund, meanwhile, wanted to find the source of Moravec's funding and disrupt the alliances Brunhild and her allies had built in Neustria. Her spies reported that Bishop Praetextatus was bribing nobles with Brunhild's treasure. Fredegund wanted Praetextatus publicly humiliated. Chilperic, eager to please her, convened a church council in Paris to try the bishop for treason. Knowing they had allies among the clergy, Gregory of Tours, despite being an Austrasian ally, attended. Gregory's account of the trial is biased, portraying it as a show trial driven by Fredegund. Chilperic accused Praetextatus of inciting rebellion and trying to kill him. Gregory, refusing to condemn Praetextatus, was threatened by Chilperic and offered a bribe by Fredegund, which he refused. Fredegund then had other bishops pressure Praetextatus to plead guilty, promising leniency. Praetextatus confessed and was stripped of his rank, beaten and exiled. Despite the questionable means used to secure his confession, Moravec's support in Neustria crumbled. Gregory was monitored, but Moravec was still at large. Then Duke Boso, in another act of duplicity, betrayed Moravec again. He relayed a false message inviting Moravec to Therouanne, where Chilperic's men lay in wait. Moravec rode into the trap and, facing capture and torture, asked his friend Galien to kill him before Chilperic arrived. Moravec was dead. Rumors spread that Fredegund had orchestrated Moravec's death, a claim Gregory eagerly repeated, pointing to Boso and Bishop Aegidius's ties to the queen. That autumn, Chilperic lost 2 heirs, Moravec and Fredegund's son Samson, who died of dysentery. Only Audovera's son Clovis and Fredegund's son Clothar remained. Despite his losses, Chilperic celebrated, moving his court to Paris, holding games and hunts. Fredegund gave birth to another son, Dagobert, a name meaning bright day, symbolizing their hopes for the future. In Austrasia, the mood was grim. Brunhild was a widow again, but her influence remained strong. In 57-9, she arranged her eldest daughter Ingund's marriage to the Visigothic prince Hermenegild, hoping for an alliance with Spain. In the summer of 5080, the Frankish lands were hit by heavy rains and a severe dysentery epidemic. Amidst this, Rumors circulated that Fredegund was having an affair with Bishop Bertram of Bordeaux. These rumors, attributed to Gregory by his enemy Count Ludost, were dangerous, threatening the legitimacy of Fredegund's sons. Fredegund couldn't let this stand. Her sons' right to the throne depended on their paternity being unquestioned. In September, Gregory was summoned to court on charges of treason. Gregory panicked, sought support, even from Fredegund's daughter Rigund, who publicly fasted in his favor to annoy her mother. Gregory also asked his friend Fortunatus to write a flattering poem for the trial. Fortunatus, living at Radegund's Abbey in Poitiers, where he'd found a quiet life of reading and writing with Radegund and her abbess Agnes, agreed. His poem, delivered at Chilperic's villa, praised Chilperic's intellect and poetry, which Gregory privately mocked, and significantly praised Fredegund, calling her wise in counsel and an equal ruler, sharing the cares of state. Fortunatus's poem worked. Gregory was spared, and Ludost was excommunicated and later brutally murdered by Fredegund. But the dysentery continued. Chilperic fell ill, then baby Dagobert. Fredegund, desperate, blamed the epidemic on God's punishment for her greed and Chilperic's harsh taxes. She burned the tax registers for her own cities and convinced Chilperic to burn those for the whole kingdom, forgiving all tax debts. Still, Dagobert died. Then even more tragically, her 9-year-old son Clothar fell ill. They prayed at St. Medard's tomb, but it was too late. Both boys were dead within 20 days of Gregory's trial. Fredegund was devastated, but her hold over Chilperic remained strong. He sent his only remaining heir, Prince Clovis, to the plague-ridden villa where Dagobert had died, essentially sending him to his death to please Fredegund. Somehow Clovis survived. Chilperic, seeing this as a sign, welcomed him back, but Clovis, now confident, openly threatened his enemies, including Fredegund. Fredegund, terrified for her own safety and her lack of living sons, became convinced that Clovis and his girlfriend, the daughter of one of her servants, were using witchcraft to kill her children. She had the girl tortured and disfigured, and her mother tortured until she confessed to witchcraft. Fredegund presented the confession to Chilperic, who, manipulated by her fear, had Clovis arrested and turned over to her. Clovis was reportedly murdered by Fredegund, his body buried quickly to hide the deed. Fredegund also sent soldiers to murder Clovis's mother, Autovera, now a vulnerable widow in a convent. Autovera's daughter, Basina, the sole survivor of her family, was sent to Radegund's convent. Fredegund's servant, who had confessed under torture, recanted but was burned alive as a witch. Fredegund, having eliminated her stepsons, was now even more powerful, albeit with only a daughter, Regund, and a precarious hold on the throne. Brunhild, now firmly in control in Austrasia as regent for young Childebert, faced challenges from disgruntled nobles who thought she should step aside. The anti-Brunhild faction was led by Dukes Ursio and Berthefried. Fredegund, hearing of this discontent, saw an opportunity and began communicating with them, likely sending bribes. They also sought support from Duke Guntram Boso of Soissons, a wealthy and sadistic figure known for his elaborate clothes and brutal treatment of slaves. Fredegund wanted Soissons back, and Boso, despite his past loyalty to Brunhild, was open to offers. Together, Boso, Ursio, and Berthefried plotted to